I know that by titling this video the S&P 500 of watches, I've invited a lot of people that hate the idea of investing in watches. But before you think that's what this is, hear me out. So let's define the two quickly. The S&P 500 is an index tracking the top 500 stocks on the American Stock Exchange. Now the Rolex Submariner, it's a watch. So they're basically the same thing. What the Rolex Submariner, however, tracks is the 500 times during the day at which you look at it and forget to notice the time. So one tracks stocks, one tracks stupidity. So what really is the point of comparison? The S&P 500 and the Submariner share more similarities than what you can put down on paper. Let's go through them. So the first similarity. The Rolex Submariner is the poster child of the modern luxury watch. It's the watch design that's synonymous with what is interpreted to be a classic Rolex watch. It is identifiably Rolex. It's the most famous watch of the most famous watch brand. Now, the S&P 500 is the face of the stock market. The stock market is never spoken about, whether superficially or in detail, without mentioning either the S&P 500 or its constituents. It is sort of omniscient like the Submariner in the world of investing. So, Submariner in the world of watches, S&P 500 in the world of stocks. It's kind of always a good option, and it's an idea that just seems to linger in the background. Now the second similarity, the S&P 500 is basic. It's a basic option just like the Submariner is in the world of watches. It is also the ideal option that applies to the most number of people, like the Submariner. Although it is ridiculously expensive, so you can't call it realistic. It is thought of as the low effort, low thought, low risk, and really the best option. Now the third similarity. The S&P 500 encompasses all levels of investors, and so does the Submariner. What do I mean by that? Well, let's get into it. Day one watch enthusiasts and day 1 million degenerates all appreciate the Submariner. And they know of it, naturally. You don't have to have a deep and long history with watches or investing to get on the S&P 500 or the Submariner bandwagon. From what I can make of the retail investor, essentially start off with the S&P 500, gets more and more confident because there's a bull market, gets into individual stock picking, and then there's a bear market, and then the built-up ego of the until then successful individual stock picker is deflated, which causes them to return to the S&P 500 as their safety retreat. Some watch enthusiasts go through the same thing. You start off in the hobby with superficial interests, and then you get a little deeper into it, and then you get really into the level of degeneracy, and then you build up a collection of eccentric watches and slowly feel the pull once again towards a simple monochromatic everyday tool watch. Because it just removes having to think. That's the basic idea behind these monochromatic, simple, modest luxury watches. They're just basic three-handers, and you don't have to think about setting the calendar. You don't think about what exactly you're wearing because it doesn't have to match. It's monochromatic and it's steel. You don't think about scratching gold, for example, and it's not too large, it's not too small. Yeah, there's just not much thought that goes into it, and that's sometimes really appreciated. In some phases of your life, it's just the thing you want from this watch hobby. So the fourth similarity then. Simplicity. You get one, you forget about it. It's one and done. It doesn't require effort post-purchase. And pre-purchase, you can dollar cost average with the Submariner too. So essentially you go every month to your AD, you buy some bullshit for the sales guy, and you pretend to care about his life and his story and chat watches, even though it's extremely superficial. Most of the time, they're not really too into the watch game, they're into the sales game. You pretty much dollar cost average your way into a Submariner. You get your return back in a different unit, satisfaction. The satisfaction of acquisition that you don't have with the S&P 500. It's also a monetary return on investment if you decide to flip the watch. Okay, so now I want to cover some of my thoughts on this actual watch. This is the newest Rolex Submariner reference, the 126610. In a previous video, I stated that I preferred the generation prior with the maxi case and the more blocky aesthetics, but have those opinions of mine changed? Well, let's get into it. So here's a quick overview of the differences on paper in terms of the dimensions. What do you notice? The change in lugs, they're smoothened. There's not such a stark bracelet to watch case blocky contrast due to the more curved lug design. The change in the lug distance is kind of important because it's now 21 millimeters, and most people wanting to change this strap probably find that annoying. The tapering of the bracelet has also changed, which, yeah, it's kind of nice. Was it necessary? I don't think so. Some people would argue that it really does help the watch, but to me, they're both equally good. My thoughts have sort of mellowed out in terms of the differences. I still like the maxi case, but now I think this one looks good too. I mean, they're so close, they're so similar. It's hard to say I dislike one and I like one because they're virtually almost the same thing. They wear slightly differently, but even there, it's marginal. I would pick the newest reference, despite having said that the older case dimensions suit me more because of the movement. I think that advancement really overshadows everything else. The minor aesthetic changes of the dial, they don't matter to me at all. So how does this watch wear? Well, it wears exactly as expected. It wears slightly differently to the older reference, but some people would say it's better, some people would say not. I'd say it's just really the same thing. It's still ideal. The older one is also ideal. It's perfect feeling on the wrist, perfectly in terms of how it sits, the size, the way it looks, the dimensions in general, and the tactile weight on your wrist as well. I love that. The Oyster bracelet is solid as ever. It was also solid in the previous generation because all 6-digit references have had the new bracelets. It really doesn't get much better in terms of a simple watch than this. Do I want one of these despite the fact that it's simple, it's a three-hander, it's cliche and boring? Absolutely. I don't see how anyone cannot want one of these, someone that's not owned it. It's got that never-ending charm and it's got quintessence. That's the word, that's the key word here. So those are my thoughts on the S&P 500 compared to the Rolex Submariner. Share yours.